hoping too much. But he needed the cart to get Tam to Emmons Field, and for the cart he needed Bella. Necessity made him hope a little. The barn doors stood open, one creaking on its hinges as it shifted in the wind. The interior looked as it always had, at first. Then his eyes fell on empty stalls, the stall doors ripped from their hinges. Bella and the cow were gone. Quickly he went to the back of the barn. The cart lay on its side, half the spokes broken out of its wheels. One shaft was only a foot-long stump. The despair he had been holding at bay filled him. He was not sure he could carry Tam as far as the village, even if his father could bear to be carried. The pain of it might kill Tam more quickly than the fever. Still, it was the only chance left. He had done all he could do here. As he turned to go, his eyes fell on the hacked-off cart shaft lying on the straw-strewn floor. Suddenly, he smiled. Hurriedly, he set the lantern and the sword on the straw-covered floor, and in the next instant he was wrestling with the cart, tipping it back over to fall upright with a snap of more breaking spokes, then throwing his shoulder into it to heave it over on the other side. The undamaged shaft stood straight out. Snatching up the sword, he hacked at the well-seasoned ash. To his pleased surprise, great chips flew with his strokes, and he cut through as quickly as he could have with a good axe. When the shaft fell free, he looked at the sword blade in wonder. Even the best sharpened axe would have dulled chopping through that hard-aged wood, but the sword looked as brightly sharp as ever. He touched the edge with his thumb, then hastily stuck it in his mouth. The blade was still razor-sharp. But he had no time for wonder. Blowing out the lantern, there was no need to have the barn burned down on top of everything else. He gathered up the shafts and ran back to get what he had left at the house. Altogether, it made an awkward burden. Not a heavy one, but hard to balance and manage. The cart shafts shifting and twisting in his arms as he stumbled across the plowed field. Once back in the forest, they were even worse, catching on trees and knocking him half off his feet. They would have been easier to drag, but that would leave a clear trail behind him. He intended to wait as long as possible before doing that. Tam was right where he had left him, seemingly asleep. He hoped it was sleep. Suddenly fearful, he dropped his burdens and put a hand to his father's face. Tam still breathed, but the fever was worse. The touch roused Tam, but only into a hazy wakefulness. "Is that you, boy?" he breathed. "Worried about you.
Oh yeah, put the hat
Dreams of days gone.
like that.
Nightmares." Murmuring softly, he drifted off again. "Don't worry," Rand said. He laid Tam's coat and cloak over him to keep off the wind.
Battle is beginning.
"I'll get you to Nine Neve just as quickly as I can." As he went on, as much to reassure himself as for Tam's benefit, he peeled off his blood-stained shirt, hardly even noticing the cold in his haste to be rid of it, and hurriedly pulled on the clean one. Throwing his old shirt away made him feel as if he had just had a bath. "We'll be safe in the village in no time, and the wisdom will set everything right. You'll see. Everything's going to be all right." That thought was like a beacon as he pulled on his coat and bent to tend Tam's wound. They would be safe once they reached the village, and Nynaeve would cure Tam. He just had to get him there. Chapter 6. The Westwood. In the moonlight, Rand could not really see what he was doing, but Tam's wound seemed to be only a shallow gash along the ribs, no longer than the palm of his hand. He shook his head in disbelief. He had seen his father take more of an injury than that, and not even stop work except to wash it off. Hastily he searched Tam from head to foot for something bad enough to account for the fever, but the one cut was all he could find. Small as it was, that lone cut was still grave enough. The flesh around it burned to the touch. It was even hotter than the rest of Tam's body, and the rest of him was hot enough to make Rand's jaws clench. A scalding fever like that could kill or leave a man a husk of what he had once been. He soaked a cloth with water from the skin and laid it across Tam's forehead. He tried to be gentle about washing and bandaging the gash on his father's ribs, but soft groans still interrupted Tam's low muttering. Stark branches loomed around them, threatening as they shifted in the wind. Surely the Trollocs would go on their way when they failed to find Tam and him. When they came back to the farmhouse and found it still empty. He tried to make himself believe it, but the wanton destruction at the house, the senselessness of it, left little room for belief of that sort. Believing they would give up short of killing everyone and everything they could find was dangerous, a foolish chance he could not afford to take. Trollocs. Light above, Trollocs. Creatures out of the Gleeman's Tale coming out of the night to bash in the door. And a fade. Light shine on me, a fade. Abruptly, he realized he was holding the untied ends of the bandage in motionless hands. frozen like a rabbit that's seen a hawk's shadow, he thought scornfully. With an angry shake of his head, he finished tying the bandage around Tam's chest. Knowing what he had to do, even getting on with it, did not stop him being afraid. When the Trollocs came back, they would surely begin searching the forest around the farm for some trace of the people who had escaped them. The body of the one he had killed would tell them those people were not far off. Who knew what a Fade would do, or could do? On top of that, his father's comment about Trollocs hearing was as loud in his mind as if Tam had just said it. He found himself resisting the urge to put a hand over Tam's mouth to still his groans and murmurs. Some tracked by scent. What can I do about that? Nothing. He could not waste time worrying over problems he could do nothing about. You have to keep quiet, he whispered in his father's ear. The Trollocs will be back. Tam spoke in hushed, forced tones. You're still lovely, Kari. As lovely as a girl. Rand grimaced. His mother had been dead 15 years. If Tam believed she was still alive, then the fever was even worse than Rand had thought. How could he be kept from speaking, now that silence might mean life? Mother wants you to be quiet, Rand whispered. He paused to clear his throat of a sudden tightness. She had had gentle hands. He remembered that much. Kari wants you to be quiet. Here, drink. Tam gulped thirstily from the water skin, but after a few swallows, he turned his head aside and began murmuring softly again, too low for Rand to understand. He hoped it was too low to be heard by hunting Trollocs, too. Hastily, he got on with what was needed. 3 of the blankets he wove around and between the shafts cut from the cart, contriving a makeshift litter. He would only be able to carry one end, letting the other drag on the ground, but it would have to do. From the last blanket, he cut a long strip with his belt knife, then tied one end of the strip to each of the shafts. As gently as he could, he lifted Tam onto the litter, wincing with every moan. His father had always seemed indestructible. Nothing could harm him, nothing could stop him, or even slow him down. For him to be in this condition almost robbed Rand of what courage he had managed to gather. But he had to keep on. That was all that kept him moving. He had to. When Tam finally lay on the litter, Rand hesitated, then took the sword belt from his father's waist. When he fastened it around himself, it felt odd there. It made him feel odd. Belt and sheath and sword together only weighed a few pounds, but when he sheathed the blade, it seemed to drag at him like a great weight. Angrily, he berated himself. This was no time or place for foolish fancies. It was only a big knife. How many times had he daydreamed about wearing a sword and having adventures? If he could kill one Trolloc with it, he could surely fight off any others as well. Only he knew all too well that what had happened in the farmhouse had been the purest luck. And his daydream adventures had never included his teeth chattering, or running for his life through the night, or his father at the point of death. Hastily, he tucked the last blanket around Tam, and laid the water skin and the rest of the cloths beside his father on the litter. With a deep breath, he knelt between the shafts and lifted the strip of blanket over his head. It settled across his shoulders and under his arms. When he gripped the shafts and straightened, most of the weight was on his shoulders. It did not seem like very much. Trying to keep a smooth pace, he set out for Emmons Field, the litter scraping along behind him. He had already decided to make his way to the quarry road and follow that to the village. The danger would almost certainly be greater along the road, but Tam would receive no help at all if he got them lost trying to find his way through the woods in the dark. In the darkness, he was almost out onto the quarry road before he knew it. When he realized where he was, his throat tightened like a fist. Hurriedly, he turned the litter around and dragged it back into the trees away, then stopped to catch his breath and let his heart stop pounding. Still panting, he turned east toward Emmons Field. Traveling through the trees was more difficult than taking Tam down the road, and the night surely did not help. But going out onto the road itself would be madness. The idea was to reach the village without meeting any Trollocs, without even seeing any if he had his wish. He had to assume the Trollocs were still hunting them, and sooner or later they would realize the two had set off for the village. That was the most likely place to go, and the quarry road the most likely route. In truth, he found himself closer to the road than he liked. The night and the shadows under the trees seemed awfully bare cover in which to hide from the eyes of anyone traveling along it. Moonlight filtering through bare branches gave only enough illumination to fool his eyes into thinking they saw what was underfoot. Roots threatened to trip him at every step. Old brambles snagged his legs, and sudden dips or rises in the ground had him half falling as his foot met nothing but air where he expected firm earth, or stumbling when his toes struck dirt while still moving forward. Tam's mutterings broke into a sharp groan whenever one of the shafts bumped too quickly over a root or rock. Uncertainty made him peer into the darkness until his eyes burned. Listened as he had never listened before. Every scrape of branch against branch, every rustle of pine needles, brought him to a halt, ears straining, hardly daring to breathe for fear he might not hear some warning sound, for fear he might hear that sound. Only when he was sure it was just the wind would he go on. Slowly, weariness crept into his arms and legs, driven home by a night wind that mocked his cloak and coat. The weight of the litter, so little at the start, now tried to pull him to the ground. His stumbles were no longer all from tripping. The almost constant struggle not to fall took as much out of him as did the actual work of pulling the litter. He had been up before dawn to begin his chores, and even with the trip to Emmons Field, he had done almost a full day's work. On any normal night, he would be resting before the fireplace, reading one of Tam's small collection of books before going to bed. The sharp chill soaked into his bones, and his stomach reminded him that he had had nothing to eat since Mr. Salvier's honey cakes. He muttered to himself, angry at not taking some food at the farm. A few minutes more could not have made any difference. A few minutes to find some bread and cheese. The Trollocs would not have come back in just a few minutes more. Or just the bread. Of course, Mr. Salvier would insist on putting a hot meal in front of him once they reached the inn. A steaming plate of her thick lamb stew, probably. And some of that bread she had been baking. And lots of hot tea. "They came over the Dragon Wall like a flood," Tam said suddenly, in a strong, angry voice, "and washed the land with blood. How many died for Lemon's sin?" Rand almost fell from surprise. Wearily, he lowered the litter to the ground and untangled himself. The strip of blanket left a burning groove in his shoulders. Struggling to work the knots out, he knelt beside Tam. Fumbling for the water bag, he peered through the trees, trying vainly in the dim moonlight to see up and down the road, not 20 paces away. Nothing moved there but shadows. Nothing but shadows. "There isn't any flood of Trollocs, Father. Not now, anyway. We'll be safe in Emmons Field soon. Drink a little water." Tam brushed aside the water bag with an arm that seemed to have regained all of its strength. He seized Rand's collar, pulling him close enough to feel the heat of his father's fever in his own cheek. "They called them savages," Tam said urgently. "The fools said they could be swept aside like rubbish. How many battles lost, how many cities burned, before they faced the truth, before the nations stood together against them?" He loosed his hold on Rand, and sadness filled his voice. "The field at Marath, carpeted with the dead, and no sound but the cries of ravens and the buzzing of flies. The topless towers of Cairene, burning in the night like torches. All the way to the shining walls they burned and slew before they were turned back. All the way to..." Rand clamped a hand over his father's mouth. The sound came again, a rhythmic thudding, directionless in the trees, fading, then growing stronger again as the wind shifted. Frowning, he turned his head slowly, trying to decide from where it came. A flicker of motion caught the corner of his eye, and in an instant he was crouched over Tam. He was startled to feel the hilt of the sword clutched tight in his hand, but most of him concentrated on the quarry road, as if the road were the only real thing in the entire world. Wavering shadows to the east slowly resolved themselves into a horse and rider, followed up the road by tall, bulky shapes trotting to keep up with the animal. The pale light of the moon glittered from spearheads and axe blades. Rand never even considered that they might be villagers coming to help.
30 seconds remaining.
He knew what they were. He could feel it, like grit scraping his bones, even before they drew close enough for moonlight to reveal the hooded cloak swathing the horseman, a cloak that hung undisturbed by the wind. All of the shapes appeared black in the night, and the horse's hooves made the same sounds that any others would. But Rand knew this horse from any other. Behind the dark rider came nightmare forms with horns and muzzles and beaks. Trollocs in a double file, all in steps, boots and hooves striking the ground at the same instant as if obeying a single mind. Rand counted 20 as they ran past. He wondered what kind of man would dare turn his back on so many Trollocs. Or on one, for that matter. The trotting column disappeared westward, thumping footfalls fading into the darkness. But Rand remained where he was, not moving a muscle except to breathe. Something told him to be certain, absolutely certain. They were gone before he moved. At long last, he drew a deep breath and began to straighten. This time the horse made no sound at all.